We are in the home of Bill and Julie Martin. It's Saturday, April 2nd, around 5:30. We're having a short discussion and a couple of questions to Mr. Martin. And Bruce Westphal, would you like to say something to Mr. Martin?
Yes, it seems that we're always having these discussions where people always come up with these lifeboat questions. And one of the questions that came up recently was, how do you build roads in freedom?
Mr. Martin?
You want me to answer that, Bruce?
Yes, please.
All right. This could be answered in a lot of different ways, but one of the ways that I do it is I say, well, how did the person get out in the ocean in the first place in his lifeboat? I mean, you got to have a better question than just to say, what are you going to do about the poor guy in the ocean that's out in the without arms and without legs? A hurricane is brewing on the horizon. How are you going to take care of him? And instead of answering that, other than to say, your question is nonsensical, I have no idea how he got there, and until you can give me all the prefatory facts here, it's impossible to answer the question rationally. But better than that, I would say this. I would say, wait a minute, before we discuss how you're going to save the guy in the lifeboat out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, let's ask a question, and that would be, what are your philosophical credentials? How do you arrive at your knowledge of what is right or wrong? What limits your knowledge and also your thought processes? And of course, the answer to that is truth and validity. And if you throw in the concept of morality, you've got an absolute criterion of rightness that all men can go by. And that's the answer to that question. By asking a philosophical question, you immediately lift the person up to a much higher plane, a coin of vantage, if you will. And you basically establish your own, because they won't be able to tell you what their credentials are. They have no philosophy at all, other than a philosophy of no philosophy. So basically, you challenge them to show you their epistemological credentials, their philosophical credentials, because until you can agree philosophically in how you determine it is what you know, you're not in a position to successfully argue anything. So Bruce, you were asking me the other day, what does the philosopher have to present in terms of his credentials here? Didn't you? Isn't that what you said one of these days?
That's what I said, all right.
Okay, well, let's name them.
I think that would be apropos. We need to know the steps that it takes to determine these things.
Let's do that. Okay, it's very simple. Philosophy means lover of wisdom or love of wisdom, and wisdom would be the right application of knowledge tempered by judgment. Without going into the definition of knowledge and judgment for the moment, let us say that the identifying characteristics of a true person who loves wisdom would be, 1, do they honor the necessity of semantic precision? Do they define their terms? It was the incomparable Voltaire who said in the 18th century that if you wish to speak to him, you must identify your definitions. You must define your terms. So without semantic precision, you're not in a position to even begin to develop any kind of organized knowledge. Organized knowledge here meaning science. The second requirement would be a method that you use that is on an absolute basis valid for all people, irrespective of time, place, and circumstance. And that method would be called the scientific method. Bruce, do you remember the 4 steps of the scientific method by any chance, I hope?
See, the first step was observation for gathering. The first step would be observation for gathering data. The second step would be hypothesis formulation. The third step would be extrapolation. And the fourth step would be we would return to observation to see if what we have extrapolated comes out correctly.
Well said, Bruce. Now I'm going to put the challenge to you. What do you mean by observation for the sake of data gathering? Can you define what you mean by observation and data?
Well, that's where you gather postulates and you put them all together so you can induct what you want to know.
No? Try again. What's observation? What's the definition of observation?
Gathering information that's exterior to yourself.
Through the use of what?
For the use of...
Through the use of what?
observation.
Senses.
Senses.
All right, when you gather in information through the use of your senses, and that gets processed in your brain, the outcome is called knowledge. The interaction between the observer and the observed. That interaction taking place inside the brain. All right, the second step would be hypothesis formulation. What are the building blocks of a hypothesis, Bruce? Do you remember that?
Postulates.
Very good. And what's a postulate?
What is a postulate? I forgot.
It's a generalization of natural phenomena. Using what kind of logic?
Inductive.
Very good. All right, and a hypothesis is simply a logical tool consisting of postulates, which are generalizations from the data that you've gathered in the first step. And when those postulates can be interrelated by the rules of logic, then you're in a position to derive new knowledge, which in the third step is called extrapolation. And of course, extrapolation, when observed to be true, without exception, will ultimately lead to a degree of confidence on the part of the person organizing this knowledge through the use of the scientific method, such that they will say, I have a corroborated hypothesis, which is the highest thing in science, which is called a what, Bruce?
A theory.
Yeah, that's right. Move over so you can see Bruce when you do that. Okay.
All right, Bruce.
A theory.
And a theory is what? A corroborated?
Corroborated hypothesis.
All right. Well, now we've got semantic precision established. We've got the scientific method accounted for, more or less, which leaves 4 more or 5 more identifying characteristics of the love for wisdom, otherwise called philosophy. So if somebody comes to you and they say, I'm a philosopher, or I'm majoring in philosophy, it would almost be incumbent upon you to ask them to define what they mean by philosophy and how can they identify the characteristics that prove their love for wisdom. Now we've answered 2. The third one would be what, Bruce?
Occam's Razor.
And you care to advise the world as to what that means, Bruce?
That essentials must not be multiplied beyond necessity.
Yes, and who said that?
Occam.
William of Occam.
William of Occam.
And when did he live?
That I don't remember.
It was the early part of the 14th century.
There you are.
All right. Can you give an example to illustrate that point?
My mind went blank.
Okay. Okay, back
That's
to
okay.
me again. Okay, a way to demonstrate Occam's Razor is to cite the Ptolemaic Hypothesis, which presupposed or premised or postulated that the Earth was the center of the then known universe, and that the Sun occupied the orbit around the Earth in that hypothesis, which was to be the third planet out. Or the Sun occupied the place of the Earth, where the Earth is today, the third planet out. And in order to predict eclipses and to account for the phenomena in the solar system, they had to make it work mathematically. They had to postulate something like 90-some assumptions, but by golly, they got it to work. And Ptolemy, who lived in the first century of the new era, was quite a mathematician in that regard. Then in the 15th century, or 16th century, 1453 I think it was, or 1543, the German astronomer Copernicus was able to get the same results that Ptolemy had by postulating half as many postulates. What allowed him to do that was that he placed the Sun where Ptolemy had placed the Earth, namely in the center of the system of things. And by doing that, he was able to get the same results that Ptolemy had been able to get with half as many assumptions. Now, yeah, that is a beautiful example of essentials must not be multiplied beyond necessity, where essentials mean postulates. The dramatic glorification of Occam's Razor took place when in 1665 and 1666, in total isolation at his ancestral home, Woolsthorpe, England, Isaac Newton, age 24, was able to get all of the results, not only of the Ptolemaic hypothesis and the Copernican system, but also the 3 laws of planetary motion by the German astronomer Kepler, by assuming or postulating 2 fundamental universal assumptions. The first being the second law of motion, which is force is equal to mass times acceleration, and also the universal law of gravitation, which is that the product of the masses along with a universal constant divided by the square of the distance that separates the masses that are involved is the special case of the second postulate. In other words, the law of gravitation. And from those and his invention and discovery of both the differential and integral calculus, he was able to prove the absolute necessity of Kepler's 3 laws of planetary motion and explain everything that both Copernicus and Ptolemy had been able to explain with only 2 assumptions, which in logic is the absolute minimum possible. That is a glorification of the theologian Occam's great statement, that celebrated great statement, that essentials must not be multiplied beyond necessity, for God favors simplicity. So with the use of semantic precision, the scientific method, and Occam's Razor, you now have a philosophical basis for truly organizing your knowledge such that it can be counted on. You can take it to the bank, if you will. You can build bridges with it. You can cure diseases with it. You can go to the moon, for goodness sakes. But it's not all. The identifying characteristics of philosophy have 3 more things to bring into the equation here. Bruce, you want to give a shot at that?
I think the next one must be the love of knowledge, love of wisdom.
The love of knowledge for
its own sake.
For its own sake. There are some examples from history that I've taught you, but I don't know whether you remember them or not.
I don't remember them.
But I'll just mention them. There were 3 mathematicians in the 19th century, one a German, Gauss, and Riemann, and a Hungarian by the name of Bolyai, and a Russian by the name of Lobachevsky. They independently had come up with a geometry of curved space. It's been misnamed as non-Euclid geometry, which is an insult to Euclid. Euclid provided for the geometry of spaces on a level plane, a two-dimensional plane, flat level. But he did not account for the geometry of curved spaces. That would be very difficult to do, and it would require a math that did not exist. And as I say, Riemann, Lobachevsky, and Bolyai had come up with a geometry of curved space, as I say, independently of each other. And it wasn't until the theory of relativity and the relativity of general relativity in 1915 that required a mathematics to explain what Einstein had been able to deduce from his postulates. And lo and behold, a mathematical avocation on 3 counts in the 19th century had been set aside, and they found them and they pulled their works out and dusted them up, and lo and behold, there was a tremendous, wonderful application of these otherwise useless exercises in mathematics. So you never know when you will need knowledge. You never know when it can come in handy. And a true philosopher does not pursue knowledge for the sake of income or prestige or a degree. He pursues it for its own sake. He loves knowledge and the development of the background of that. And then there's another identifying characteristics of a true love of wisdom, which would be, Bruce?
The seen versus the unseen. You need to take into consideration what's going to happen down the road 10 years, 100 years, whatever.
Instead of just what's happening now.
Yes.
Yeah. You're not really qualified to rationally discuss any subject whatsoever unless you take into consideration what has been unseen. In economics, for example, that would be the general effect upon all groups of people in the long run, instead of just taking into consideration the political advantages of a tax that's paying for the development of a bridge in a certain locale. It does indeed produce jobs that didn't exist before. It betters the standard of living, let us say, in that area. But that's the immediate and specific effect upon a special group of people, without taking into consideration, again, the long-term effect upon all groups of people generally. And until you do take into account what is unseen as well as seen, you cannot, in economics, assess the net gain or loss to the body politic involved. And a true philosopher will never venture forth an opinion unless he has considered, to generalize here further, the laws of nature that are either being violated or corroborated in any given argument. So the seen versus the unseen must be taken into account. That identifies 5 credentials that prove the existence of some love for wisdom, but we're not out of the woods yet. Until 1961, mankind at large was completely bereft of any absolute criterion of moral behavior. There had been approximations to it, but that would have to await a great discovery. And that great discovery would be the absolute, universally corroborable concept of property. Property being defined, Bruce, is what?
As a volitional being's life and all the derivatives thereof.
That's quite correct. How many different kinds of property would be incorporated in that definition?
See, we have a primordial, primary, and the third would be species?
No.
Not yet.
Secondary.
Secondary.
Secondary. And, you have your bodily function, that's your biological function, your life. That's your primordial property. Your primary property would be your life, your thoughts, which are random occurrences in the brain. The organization of those thoughts into articulated speech would be ideas. And then, of course, you have the actions that follow from the primary property, the primary property and your biological property or your primordial property. And those derivatives, those would be tangible derivatives, and those would be called your secondary property, your estate assets, for example. So you have property defined as volitional life and all derivatives of volitional life, broken down into 3 categories: primordial property, primary property, and secondary property. Now, with that definition, you can come up with a criterion for freedom that has never existed before. And that definition would be what, Bruce?
I don't know.
Yeah, you know the definition of freedom.
The societal structure, I forgot it.
Okay, it's societal condition rather than structure that exists when
every person has 100% control over his own property.
Yeah, what is it? Property, you say? Control of what?
His own property.
Yes. Property being defined as his life and all the derivatives of his life.
Wow.
So we're getting somewhere here. Now, the great lesson here to be observed here in this little brief discussion, spontaneously and unrehearsed, is that when you can have a concept of property that allows you to define freedom, then you can also see what is implied postulatorially in that definition. In other words, the postulates that integrate or bring together all the study of human behavior are, as implied in the definition of freedom, that all men live to acquire property, or as some would put it, all men live to pursue happiness, and all concepts of happiness pursued through moral action are equally valid, meaning logically acceptable for deriving the condition called freedom and for living your own life, and refuting all other systems of so-called government. So property is a constraint upon your behavior that is necessary for the condition called freedom to be built, to be attained. Number one. Number two, we have established that your thought processes have to conform to the established rules of logic. And the word for that is validity, and also your constraints on what you accept or don't accept in terms of the information that you will use to develop your philosophy or your science would be limited by what is observed. What is not observable is not included in science. It is not part of rationality. Rationality being defined as the use of the scientific method in arriving at conclusions. Now, what can we do with this philosophically? We can render the question about the lifeboat as totally irrelevant and nonsensical. And what you have done here is you have lifted the individual up to a higher plane of advantage here, that for the first time in his life will make him think about how he determines what it is that he thinks he knows, and on an absolute basis for all people and all things. And one of the great conclusions that comes from this is that essentially everything he has ever learned in his entire life, be it political or religious or otherwise, is dead wrong. End of the discussion. Sign off.